Standardville was constructed by a coal mining company according to a well-engineered town plan designed to set a new standard in company-built mining towns. The seeds of Standardville were sown in 1912 when coal began to be mined from the valley, and by 1917 Standardville was constructed. The miners and their families were housed in modern, steam-heated homes complete with landscaping. Many of the town residents were immigrants who had come to the U.S. from Italy and Greece. Standardville was a company town through and through, with most of the establishments, such as the store, hospital, and recreational hall, owned by the Standard Coal Company. The town was designed to keep miners and their families happy in their little valley. The happiness did not last, however. Standardville in the 1920s was a stage for several notable labor incidents. One such incident occurred in June 1922, when striking miners attempted to prevent a train full of strikebreakers from entering the town. The striking miners ambushed the incoming train just as it emerged from a tunnel. Gunfire echoed off the canyon walls as strikers fired on the train. The strikebreakers returned fire. Though short, the battle did result in the death of one Arthur Webb, who was employed by the mining company as a guard, but was acting as an engine stoker on board the train. Other combatants received only wounds. The killing of Arthur Webb resulted in the governor of Utah declaring martial law and ordered the National Guard to the area to reestablish order. Public sentiment against unions grew, and many of the strikers were defamed as being un-American. The years after World War II saw the implementation of new safety laws and rising expenses spent on accessing deeper veins of coal. The mine was closed in 1950, and with it, any reason to stay in the town. By 1954, the residents had moved on, and the town was dead. Grafton is one of the oldest ghost towns in Utah and is certainly one of the most scenic ghost towns in the United States. The story of Grafton began in 1849 when the town was established in order to grow cotton. Brigham Young, the leader of the LDS Church, wanted to make Utah, known as Deseret at the time, a self-sufficient territory, so he sent colonists to various parts of the territory to build towns and produce the raw materials needed to establish self-sufficiency. Grafton was first established along the banks of the Virgin River. The townspeople quickly regretted their first choice of location when the Virgin River flooded and swept part of the town away. On the night of the dramatic flood, a one Mrs. Tenney was in labor giving birth to a son. Floodwaters began flowing through the cracks of their simple cabin, and it was immediately clear that Mrs. Tenney needed to be moved before the cabin was destroyed. Mr. Tenney, along with some neighbors, placed his wife in a wagon box, where she was floated to higher ground, and just in the nick of time. Their cabin was swept from its foundations and carried away with the raging floodwaters. The experience so impressed the Tenneys that they named their newborn son Marvelous Flood Tenney. The town site was moved to a different location after the flood, but all was not plain sailing for Grafton. By the 1860s, the pioneers had established homes surrounded by fields and orchards. The cotton-growing venture achieved only mild success. During the 1860s, tensions with the local Native Americans increased to the point where some of the local natives raided Grafton and left some of the settlers dead. Some of the headstones in Grafton Cemetery bear witness to this tragic fact. Southern Utah in the 1870s saw a surprising shift in agriculture, going from cotton to mulberry trees and silk. Grafton during this period became a modest producer of silk for about 20 years. By the 1890s, other local settlements in the county outgrew Grafton, and many people moved away in search of better opportunities. In the late 1920s, the town was identified as an ideal location for Hollywood westerns, and the first talkie, filmed outside of a studio, called In Old Arizona, was filmed in Grafton in 1928. In Old Arizona was nominated for 5 Academy Awards, and is known as an early motion picture treasure today. As a film set, the town grew during this period. The real population of Grafton remained small and finally became zero in 1944. Grafton, however, remained a semi-popular setting for movies. The most famous movie filmed in Grafton is 1969's Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Grafton is among the most visited ghost towns in Utah and has been placed in a state of arrested decay. Grafton also hosts one of the prettiest races in the West each November for the Butch Cassidy 10K. Frisco has the dubious honor of being at one time the wildest town in Utah and possibly the western U.S. It all began in 1875 when two miners made a discovery of silver in the San Francisco mountain range in Utah. They dug a shaft incredibly rich with ore. Hedging their bets, they sold their claim for $25,000 in 1876. The new owner named the mine the Horn Silver Mine, after the way the silver was found in the shape resembling a ram's horn. Rich ore yields meant more mines and the birth of a town. The town might have been called San Francisco after the mountain range it was located in, but wisely chose to avoid confusion and lawsuits with the more famous city in California, so the town was named Frisco. Frisco was a hard town full of hard people. Water was very scarce and had to be piped in from distant springs or shipped in via wagon. The scarcity and high price of water led to alcohol being the preferred way to quench a thirst. 23 saloons, as well as gambling dens and brothels, spoiled the miners for choice in ways they could spend their hard-earned wages. Crime, including murder, was rampant in the town, so much so that apparently a meat wagon made frequent rounds of Frisco to collect bodies for burial. The crime became so problematic that the town fathers hired Marshal William Pearson from Pioche, Nevada, another hard-mining, hard-drinking town. It is said that upon his arrival, Pearson made it known that he had no intention of arresting or jailing anyone. The way he saw it, lawbreakers had two choices: either skip town or buy a coffin. Apparently no one cared to take the new lawman seriously, and 6 men ended up in Boot Hill Cemetery during his first night on the job. After that, the town became quieter. Frisco was made up of more than rough saloons and seedy brothels. Children attended school, people attended church. Hotels housed visitors, and the Frisco Times kept the citizenry informed with news from the wider world. Frisco's glory ended on February 12, 1885, when as the day shift was preparing to enter the Horn Silver Mine, they experienced what they must have thought was an earthquake, but really was the mine collapsing. At the time of the collapse, the depth of the mine was nearly 1 kilometer deep. Astonishingly, no one was killed in the collapse. Another shaft was soon sunk, but the silver ore veins proved too difficult to access, and Frisco dwindled. Mining continued on a smaller scale until 1920, when no one had a permanent residence in Frisco. Today, most of the original town site and its buildings are on privately owned property, though the beehive kilns that once fed the smelters before the railroad reached the town are publicly accessible and still reek of heavily charred wood. In the 1860s, U.S. Army soldiers under the command of General Patrick O'Connor began prospecting in a narrow canyon 20 miles south of Tooele, Utah. The soldiers had become aware that the local Native American tribe, the Goshutes, were using bullets, partially made of silver, as well as making silver jewelry. They traced the Goshutes and their silver to some rudimentary diggings in Ophir Canyon. The soldiers seized control of the diggings, staked out new claims, and began a few basic mines. Serious mining operations did not begin until about 1870, when a formal town was founded. The town itself was little more than a narrow strip of buildings stretched along a steep and narrow canyon. Throughout the decade, Ophir's population quickly swelled into the thousands, as the mines yielded large amounts of lead, silver, and zinc, as well as some small amounts of copper and gold. The town boasted hotels, drugstores, mercantiles, 2 schools, a fortified post office, multiple saloons, a couple of dance halls, as well as a red light district. Large mines such as the Pocatello, the Ophir, Shamrock, Silveropolis produced tens of millions of dollars worth of ore throughout the 1870s. By the early 1880s, the easy ore in the canyon was mined out. Mining activity slowed as the mine shifted from horizontal shafts to vertical shafts, and the miner shanties were slowly replaced with orchards and small farming plots. Throughout the 20th century, fewer and fewer people called Ophir home. Maggie Tolman Porter, who grew up on a ranch in nearby Rush Valley, remembered visiting Ophir during the early part of the 20th century. Quote, "Ophir was a beautiful little mining town. I can still see in my mind's eye the beautiful autumn colors as we drove up the canyon to do our marketing. I can remember the purple elderberries along the creek and the flashing maples and wildflowers. I can still remember the ruins of a house by the roadside, a mile or two from the town. Mother showed me the blackened ruins and told me how the mother and father had locked their 2 little children in the home and then both went into town and got drunk. Their home caught fire and the children were burned to death. I was always saddened by the sight of those ruins." Mining activity in Ophir finally ceased in 1971, and the town was all but a ghost town. Today, the town has experienced a revival, with the town population booming in the summer months. Many of the old buildings and homes have been restored, with the addition of new homes in town. A visitor to Ophir can still see the tailing piles and the old minecart rails that once meant a busy and profitable life in Ophir. Mercure is the town that refused to die. Over the last 150 years, Mercure has been mined heavily and is also the birthplace of one of the most important gold extraction processes ever devised. As a town, Mercure began life known as Lewiston, when prospectors found enough gold to justify building a town in 1870. Gold mining was the business driving the town between 1870 to 1873, when the town reached a population of 2,000. Between 1874 and 1878, the gold veins were mined out, and the town became a ghost town for the first time. The town's first resurrection began in April 1879, when a German prospector, Ari Pinedo, discovered cinnabar, a natural form of mercury. Believing he had discovered a huge amount of mercury, he named his claim Mercure, which, as one might guess, is German for mercury. The mercury that Ari Pinedo found also contained a fair amount of gold, but the gold was unable to be extracted with the known ore processing practices of the time. Still, mining activity continued to grow in the area. In about 1890, Pinedo sold his mercury claim for $10,000 to a group of men from Nebraska who formed a mining company, and a new mill was erected near the claim. The mill, however, was a total failure, and the mining company was set to fold. One of the men who purchased the claim sent an ore sample to Colorado to undergo a new ore treatment process using cyanide. The sample proved promising, and a new cyanide mill was built at Mercure. With the new mill came new money and a new town. The town could no longer be called Lewiston because another town in the Utah Territory had taken the name. The residents decided to adopt the name of Pinedo's claim, and Mercure was born again. The 1890s were good to Mercure. A new cyanide mill, the Golden Gate, was built in 1898, and it was the first of its kind. The mill required an enormous amount of electrical power, and a hydroelectric dam was built 32 miles away to feed its electrical need. June 26, 1902, a grease fire broke out in a Chinese restaurant about 9 in the morning. The fire spread quickly throughout the business district. By noon, every building in the business district was in ashes. The residential district as well as the mill survived the fire, and the town was quickly rebuilt. And by 1913, mining and milling were no longer profitable, and the town withered until 1917, when, for the second time, it became a ghost town. Mining operations in Mercure began again in the 1930s, and lasted until the United States entered World War II, and then began again in the 1980s. Today, Mercure's quiet. No mills, no town, and few ruins. Just the tailings and scars around a very small valley where once over 10,000 people lived and worked. In 1870, several prospectors found a rich outcropping in a canyon in Juab County. Believing they had found a mammoth load of pay dirt, they called their claim Mammoth. They opened a mine, and a small camp sprung up at the head of the canyon right below the mine. By 1873, the original owners were not as enthusiastic about their mammoth mine, and traded their control of the mine to the McIntyre brothers, in exchange for their herd of Texas Longhorns that were on their way to market in Salt Lake City. The McIntyre brothers invested heavily in the mine, and it paid off. Soon, tons of ore containing gold, silver, and copper, as well as lead, were hauled out of the mine each month. Other mines in the area were dug, with mills and smelters to process the wealth-laden ore. Mammoth grew along with the mines. Mammoth faced one serious problem, however: water. The valley had very little water, and what water there was guzzled by the mining process. Drinking water had to be shipped in. A town resident had to pay 10 cents a gallon, or $1 a barrel. In 2020, that's $2.14 a gallon, or $21 a barrel. By 1890, 2 new mills were built in the Lower Canyon, the Sioux and the Mammoth. One man, George H. Robinson, determined to leave his mark on the canyon, as he worked as an engineer for the McIntyres at the Sioux mill. He plotted a town around the mill and named it after himself. Robinson, it is said, was an egocentric man, and he wore on the patience of the McIntyres. Robinson was eventually sacked, but his town lived on. The town of Robinson was so close to Mammoth that it became known as Lower Town, and Mammoth became known as Upper Town. A railroad was built into Robinson and served both communities. Eventually, enough people crowded into the canyon that the two towns grew together. At its height, Mammoth boasted many large hotels, saloons, churches, a baseball diamond, as well as hospitals and restaurants. Mines continued to yield rich ores, and some miners began to high-grade chunks of valuable ore out with them at the end of their shift. They smuggled ore out any way they could, in bandages and hats, lunch pails, etc. The McIntyres became wise to the smuggling and constructed what were called dry rooms, where miners changed their clothes before and after their shifts to reduce the chance of smuggling. One local saloon owner made his fortune by trading drinks for the smuggled ore. He stashed the ore until one day he sold the saloon and disappeared into the west, not to be heard from again. Once a thriving town of nearly 3,000 people, by 1930, the population of Mammoth was fewer than 750 souls. Rising costs of production and lower-grade ore had given people little reason to stay. Over the course of the next few decades, many of the buildings were robbed away to be used in other construction, or simply rotted away in the sun. Few people call Mammoth home today, and some minor digging still happens in the valley. In 1857, General Albert Sidney Johnston was ordered by President James Buchanan to the Utah Territory to put down a Mormon rebellion that never really existed. The Mormons, after being persecuted for their religion in the East, had moved west to Utah in 1847 in search of peace and isolation to practice their religion. The idea of a Mormon rebellion began with federal judges who, after a brief sojourn in Utah, returned to Washington, D.C. with exaggerated stories of what the Mormons were up to. Believing the judges' shocking stories and seeking to distract the country from escalating tensions over slavery, President Buchanan sent 1/3 of the entire U.S. Army to Utah to enforce federal rule over the territory. The Army founded Camp Floyd on the west side of Fairfield, the two being separated by a small, muddy creek. The camp was named after John B. Floyd, who served as Secretary of War and who would later become a Confederate general. To build the camp, some local stone was quarried, and tens of thousands of adobe bricks were made. The Mormons profited from the construction by making many of the bricks needed. In a very short period of time, Camp Floyd was the seat of United States power in the vast Utah Territory and the largest U.S. Army base in the world. Fairfield grew too. Across the muddy creek, buildings sprang up to ease the boredom and lighten the pockets of the soldiers. Saloons, brothels, gambling halls, and other such establishments crowded the road across from the camp and became known as Frogtown. John Carson, a Mormon and resident of Fairfield, constructed a large inn to offer rooms to stagecoach travelers and visitors to the camp, as well as a place for more restrained and refined entertainment compared to that of Frogtown. The inn also served as a Pony Express station. From 1859 to 1860, Camp Floyd and Fairfield was the third largest town in Utah after Salt Lake City and Provo, with the population reaching 7,000. By 1861, the Civil War was imminent. In May of that year, Word arrived via the Pony Express that the camp was to be abandoned and the troops to march to Fort Leavenworth. Before leaving, the soldiers sold or destroyed that which they could not take with them. The Mormons profited again by purchasing millions of dollars worth of goods for a mere $100,000. General Johnston, who had at first commanded the camp, became one of the first generals in the Confederate Army and was killed later in the Battle of Shiloh. Today, very little remains of the actual fort. The only building left from the original fort is the old commissary, which stands across from what was Frogtown. The commissary serves as the museum today and houses many interesting and personal artifacts from the people who once called Camp Floyd home. John Carson's Inn, too, still stands and is open to visitors as a museum known as the Stagecoach Inn. The Mormons were not the only religious group to see Utah as a place to practice their religion in peace. Molokans were a tight-knit group of Russian Protestants who arrived in the state in 1914 to settle and build an agricultural community in northern Utah. The Molokans had broken off from the Russian Orthodox Church in the 18th century. The Molokans and their pacifist ways were tolerated in Russia until the beginning of the 20th century, when the government of the Tsar demanded men to fight in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. Rather than betray their religious beliefs, many fled Russia for America and settled in California. In California, the Molokans flourished, but felt their way of life was threatened by American values they found to be in conflict with their religious ones. In 1914, the Pacific Land and Water Company owned a sizable chunk of land in Box Elder County. They advertised the land as rich and fertile, with plenty of water for farming. Seeking to get back to their agricultural and religious roots, some Molokan families purchased land and moved to Utah, where they were greeted not with green hills and loamy soil, but with wind, dry soil, and sagebrush. Some families opted to stay and make a go of a settlement, while others moved on in search of greener pastures. In spite of the less than ideal conditions, the Molokans built homes and planted gardens. They practiced their peculiar faith in peace and isolation. The population grew with the births of children between 1914 and 1916. There were also enough children in the village to warrant a small school built by the county. By 1916, however, it was clear that the village could not last. Drought and rabbits had taken their toll on their crops, and many families moved away. Most returned to California. Nobody knows what name the Russians gave their town because they kept to themselves. Today, very little remains of Russian Village. The school foundations and a two-grave cemetery are all that is left. The graves are remarkable for their headstones written in Cyrillic letters, which replaced two simple wooden crosses placed at the time of burial. The graves are of two women. One, Anna Kaplikov, who died when she was accidentally shot by her husband, and the other is of Mary Kaplikov, a sister-in-law who died in childbirth. Knightsville is unique among Utah mining towns. Unlike its very close neighbor Eureka, Knightsville was as dry as a bone. The town founder and mine owner, Jesse Knight, wanted to build a model mining town and forbade any saloons from operating in his town. Knightsville was constructed at the very end of the 19th century, when Jesse Knight, a Mormon with no mining experience, showed up in Eureka with $100 and an aim to strike it rich. Contrary to the advice of experienced miners and geologists, Jesse began to dig on a little flat, only 1.5 miles east of Eureka. Jesse's first shaft struck a very rich ore vein, and Jesse was rich overnight. Jesse called his mine the Humbug, as it was a way to stick it to all the people who told him he was a fool to sink a shaft where he did. Jesse Knight saw more mining success in the district and became known as the Mormon mining wizard. Knightsville grew quickly and by 1907 had a population of 1,000 people, many of whom were Mormons. It said Jesse Knight, who was a devout Mormon, hated to see women and children neglected by their mining husbands, who would drink much of their income away on the weekends in Eureka. For this reason, he banned saloons in Knightsville. The town, however, did have a dry goods store, confectionaries, a school, a post office, and a Mormon church. Jesse Knight also differed from other mine owners in that he gave his miners Sundays off and encouraged them to attend church. By 1915, the ore had petered out, and the town was abandoned. Many of the homes and buildings were relocated to Eureka, and today, little remains of the town but the foundations of the school and broken household artifacts. Gold Hill lies on the western edge of Utah in Tooele County, near the border with Nevada. A remote mining town since its birth, Gold Hill has been witness to 3 revivals in the last 150 years. Gold Hill first came into existence in 1892 and was unsurprisingly named for a nearby hill that was mined for gold. The quality and value of the gold ore found in the hill varied, and overall it was barely enough to bother with. The town of Gold Hill during this period wasn't made up of anything more than tents and shanties. Once the easy gold was mined out, the people left, leaving only a land pitted with mines and mine shafts. Then in 1906, a new railroad was constructed through Nevada, and some hoped that the train would run through Gold Hill, making mining there viable again. Some people returned to Gold Hill during this time and began mining. Their hopes for a train station did not come to fruition, and the nearest a railroad came to Gold Hill was 50 miles away, leaving the town to rely on wagon freight for its support. In June 1914, and a half a world away, Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip. No one in Gold Hill at the time could have imagined that the death of the Archduke would mean life to their town. During World War I, the town boomed. New streets were surveyed, new stores were built, and the railroad finally came to Gold Hill. World War I meant the U.S. no longer had access to its usual source of arsenic, used as a pesticide, and was especially important to controlling the cotton boll weevil, which threatened important cotton crops in the southern states. Happily for the U.S., Gold Hill had plenty of arsenic to offer. World War I also proved the necessity of tungsten as a means of both protecting and killing soldiers. Tungsten more than doubled the efficiency of steel and was also used in armor-piercing rounds. Again, Gold Hill had plenty of tungsten that the U.S. government keenly needed. The golden years of Gold Hill lasted through World War I and into the Roaring Twenties until 1924, when foreign sources of arsenic collapsed the economy of Gold Hill. The town withered again, but held a small population of miners until 1938, when the railroad left and literally took their rails with them. The actions of Europeans would change the fortunes of Gold Hill for the second time in 30 years. World War II meant another pressing need for arsenic and tungsten. The railroad came back, and the town boomed as never before. Apartment buildings were constructed, a bowling alley was built, and the town was electrified for the first time in its history. The amount of arsenic the U.S. needed was overestimated, and after only 16 months, the U.S. government closed the mines and the town changed overnight. The apartment buildings were deconstructed to recycle the materials elsewhere. The school closed in 1946, and the post office closed in 1949, and by 1952, only 5 people called Gold Hill home. Today, Gold Hill has a few buildings dating back to its boom of World War I, and a few people live in trailers. There is still some mining activity, but few miners live there permanently.